In this presentation, I want to continue to add detail to the snowman. And I'm going to focus on the carrot nose. Now, when it comes to the carrot, I'm definitely want to get started with a cone object. So I'm going to look in my parametric primitives menu. I'm going to find the cone object, and I'm just going to move this up a bit. It's clearly way too big, so I like to move my objects up all the way. I can still see them as over top of the snowman's head. And now I'll continue just to kind of play with some of these values to get a more appropriate carrot size. So I think at the scale I'm working to, if I do something like something around there, I think that's the bottom radius is still feeling a little big, so I'll make that a bit smaller, and it feels like it needs to be a little bit longer. I think that'll probably do. Now I want to rotate this carrot into space to point it in a different direction, and currently, I'll just deselect it so you can see it better, it's pointing straight up. Now I have a couple different ways I can rotate this carrot. The easiest thing is I'm going to select it, and I'm going to go to the rotate tool. Now when I go to the rotate tool, you can see that I get these three axes bands that are showing the direction in which it'll rotate. And if I roll my mouse over one of these axes bands, it'll allow me to rotate it in that direction. Now, the band kind of gives me a suggestion as to what direction it's going to rotate. If I roll my mouse over the y-axis and rotate it along y, it's just going to kind of spin. I'll Command Z to undo that. If I rotate it along the z-axis, it's not going to give me exactly what I want. Even though it's rotating to the right, its orientation will be kind of sticking out of the snowman's ear. So I'll Command Z and undo that. What I want to do is I want to rotate this according to the x-axis. And you might be scratching your head and saying, I don't really understand, I don't get the connection between the rotation bands and the color association. And the idea here is that if you look at the red axis. So the red is the x-axis, and I can look down here, and I can see that there's a little line here, and you can think of that as kind of like a skewer. And if you were to skewer a marshmallow and you're going to rotate it, it's going to rotate around that skewer or the stick. And so you can see that this red axis is running left and right, and this red axis controls the rotation around that axis. So if I click and drag on the red axis band, you can see that I'm starting to rotate, and I get this little heads-up display that tells me how far I'm rotating. If I want to rotate it exactly 90 degrees, I have a couple of options. I'll start that rotation, then I'll hold down the Shift key, and the minute I hold down Shift, you can see that it's starting to snap in 10-degree increments. Okay, so if I could just rotate it down until I see 90 and then release the mouse, and I know that carrot now is pointing towards the front of the snowman. I'll go back to the Move tool, and I'll move this carrot down, and I'll move it into the foreground. Now you see here, now because we've rotated our carrot, you can see that the axes bands with that object, or the axes direction, don't necessarily coordinate with the rest of the 3D world that we're working in. In other words, the object's y-axis has now become pointing in the direction of the z-space. And that's okay, because I'm not really concerned about which color these axes are at this point. I just know that I have to move it down, and I know that I have to move it into the foreground of the snowman. Okay, so I got that position just where I want it. And that looks pretty good. I'm going to tap the S key to zoom in on the selected, and it looks a little big. You know, it looks a little heavy, but you know what? I'll go with that exaggeration. I think it'll add some character to my snowman here now. Now, I like the cone, but I think I can get a lot more mileage out of this cone if it was a little bit more organic looking. And so what I'm going to do is introduce this concept of polygon modeling, where we'll take a primitive polygon and we'll modify it and convert it to a polygon object. Excuse me, I'll take a parametric primitive and convert it to a polygon object so we can start to play with its components. And its components will consist of points, edges, and polygons. And before we start modifying our cone into a carrot, I want to demonstrate the concept of the component mode for 3D parametric objects and how to modify this. And so I would suggest this workflow anytime you want to figure out how a tool works or how a technique works. What I'm going to do is I'm going to do File, New, and I'm just going to create a temporary blank document, and I'm going to create a simple cube. Now, this cube is currently a parametric primitive. And I can tell a couple different ways. If I look in the object manager, I can see that it has a little cube icon next to it. And just for a little bit of contrast here, I'll introduce a sphere. You can see there's the sphere has a sphere icon associated with it. And when I select either one of these objects, if I look in the attributes manager, there are parameters here that I can modify that kind of govern the size and shape of this thing. Now what I want to do is I want to convert this object from a parametric primitive. Okay, so an object that Cinema 4D can refer to and say, yeah, I know that's a cube and it's this dimension. I want to convert that to a polygon object. And the way that I can do that is there's this icon right over here just to the left of the perspective viewport. And if I roll my mouse over it, it says make it editable. Make it editable, not edible. I don't want to eat it, I want to convert it, right? So what I want to do is I want to click on that icon. And the minute that I do that, look what happens over here in the object manager. My cube loses its cube icon and ends up with this polygon object icon. When I roll my mouse over it, in fact, it even tells me that it's a polygon object and it's named cube. Now the difference between a polygon object and a parametric primitive, there's a couple of differences. And I'll move this off to the side to demonstrate this. When I select this cube, I no longer have the parameters that govern this object. In fact, Cinema 4D doesn't really acknowledge this object as a cube anymore. It doesn't care what it is. It knows that it's made up of points, edges, and polygons. And just to highlight this point, I'm going to go to my tools and doodles, and I'm going to grab this doodle paint tool here. And anytime you have a polygon, you have edges. So these are the lines. At the intersection of the edges, you have points. So I have points at all corners of this object. There's a point here and a point here and a point here. And connecting those points are edges. When you have multiple edges or multiple points that are connecting an object together, you have a polygon on the surface. Now at this point, this object, and I'll just clear off my doodle here. At this point, this object moves around just like a normal model, okay, or just like the object, the parametric primitive. But the minute that we go into component mode, so I'm going to roll my mouse over here, and first I'm going to experiment with this point mode. The minute that I select the points, I can roll over, and I can select the individual points of the object, and now I can take and sculpt and move these points around, okay? And I can just click and drag and move them according to one axis. And now this shape starts to get a little strange looking. If I roll over the edge mode, I can roll over and select the individual edges on this object. And I can take those edges and I can stretch and move those as well. If I go into the polygon mode, now I'm selecting the individual surfaces, and I'll select that and I'll move those individual surfaces around. You can see as I move either the points, edges, or polygons of this object, you can see that the object stays intact and it just kind of moves whatever we have selected. I'll select my cube object. And now, the minute that we're modifying the different components, so points, edges, and polygons, at this point, we're still kind of locked into this model and we're manipulating it. If we want to go back and start to move this model as a whole, we want to make sure we go back to this icon. Remember, this is one of our default tools. This is the model tool, or use model mode of the interface. And the minute I click on this icon, now I'm modifying the entire model, or I'm moving the whole 3D shape. If I want to go back into component mode, all I have to do is go to points, edges, or polygons and continue to manipulate those, and now I can go back to the model and move that around. I'm going to delete my cube for a moment, and I'll go back to my sphere. If I try to go into my sphere, or even if I try to go into a parametric cube and I try to go into point, edge, or polygon mode, I can't do that. It doesn't let me modify that stuff until I convert it. Until I convert this parametric primitive to a polygon object. So the minute I convert it, now I can start to play with the different components. Okay, and depending on the component mode I have selected, I'll be able to select the different objects. Now this becomes really important when we start to create some simple shapes and want to modify those shapes. Okay, now there's one other thing that I want to talk about before we start modifying our cone into a carrot. I'll just go back to the default setting of my tool. I'm going to delete all the stuff that I have on screen. I'll just get rid of it, and I'm going to reintroduce a new cube. In Cinema 4D, when we have a parametric primitive selected and we go down into the object manager, if we look over here, we have our segments. Now the segments of an object will not become visible until we do a real quick display change. And just to demonstrate that, what I'll do is I'm going to bump up the segments of my cube to 3 in all directions. I didn't see anything change on the cube view, but if we go to display and we choose a different view, so right now I'm using Girard shading and that's what you want to use, but we'll change Girard shading with lines. The minute we do that, we start to see the segmentation of this object. I just changed the segmentation to 3 according to all axes. Now I'll change it back to 1 so that you can see the result. As I move these back to the segmentation back to 1, you can see that I'm simplifying my cube object, so I have less geometry in that cube. If I bump it back up to 3, depending on the axes that I add, you can see I just added 3 segments along the y-axis, and so it created different strata along the vertical axis of this object. Finally, I'm going to add 3 to the z-axis, and you'll see that this space will divide into 3 segments. So I'll click, and I'll bump up that segmentation. Now, segmentation, you can kind of think of this as kind of like resolution for our 3D geometry. And the minute that we take a parametric primitive and we modify its segmentation and then we make it editable, now there are more variables in this object that we can control. So if I go back to my point mode and I click and select a point, now you can see that there's a point on what was once the surface of that cube. So I'll Command Z. If I want to select multiple points, I could do this a couple different ways. With the Move tool selected, I could hold down the Shift key and add to that selection. Alternatively, I want us to start experimenting with the Live Select tool, and we can find that just to the left of the Move tool, and I'll click on that tool. And the way that this Select tool works is that we get this hotspot, and if we click and start to paint around the surface of our object, anything that falls within that hotspot will become selected. Okay, so I've selected multiple points, and now I can just modify by moving or doing a number of things with these points. I'll Command Z to undo. Command Z to undo again. If I want to make a very specific selection, again, I can go to this Live Select tool. I can choose the appropriate mode that I want to be in, and at this point I want to be in point mode, and I'll click and drag around this object. If I release and I want to add to this selection, I'll hold down the Shift key and I'll click and continue to paint. As long as I'm holding down the Shift key, when I release, I've just added that to the selection. If I hold down the Control key and I paint back over anything that's been selected, it deselects from the selection. Okay? If I want to start over, I can just click off in the workspace here. Now nothing is selected, and I'll click and paint back over the object. If I want to add to the selection, I'll hold down Shift and continue to paint. And if I inadvertently overselect, I can hold down the Control key, click and drag, and anything that falls within that hotspot will be deselected. Okay? So it's important that we start to familiarize ourselves with the segmentation of an object. And now I want to point out that I'll go back to the model mode of the tool and make sure I'm back at the Move tool. So I'm in this default mode. When I go to my cube, there is no ability to control the segmentation. We lose the ability to modify our segmentation the minute that we convert this to a polygon object, because Cinema 4D no longer sees this object as a cube. It sees it as a combination of points, edges, and polygons. Okay? We'll take this concept and apply modifying the segmentation and modifying some simple points of our cone to make it look much more like a carrot, but we'll do that in the next presentation.